This is episode 482 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, another shoe drops, not something that we were surprised by, but now the U.S. Department of Energy has indicated that COVID-19 pandemic most likely began at the Wuhan Institute of Virology over in China. Something that had been kind of discussed and brought forth in a lot of different ways. But now the U.S. federal government saying that that's where they believe things got rolling. So, I think we've got a pretty good track record of calling BS on a lot of policies, both federal and state, when it comes to COVID-19, all despite neither of us having a degree in any medical field whatsoever.
Yes, there is an interesting phenomenon. It's like, Paul, well, are you a microbiologist? And it's like, no, but also the other indictment, in addition to the, quote, experts, the specialists, is, what about, where was the media in all this? They're like, they're like, oh, we can't have fake news. And many of the things, not everything, but many of the things that they called fake news were not, in fact, fake news. What they were purporting to be the truth was fake news. And so not their brightest day either, but don't expect a whole lot of soul searching and introspection from the media with regard to that. They seem like they're, I don't know, what the word is. If something is the popular, politically correct thing to do, they'll just they seem like they want to push that all day long as it's their initial reaction to things.
Yeah, it's another in a long line of things that we got right and a lot of folks got wrong. The lab leak theory, masks and their lack of effectiveness, the impact that locking down would have on children and the disproportionate impact there, as well as killing businesses. I could probably find others, but I think 4 big ones is pretty good and pretty indicative of where things stand in terms of the win and loss column here for those who were just questioning what was going on and trying to cut through often what seemed like lies. And speaking of which, real quickly, it's worth noting, we talked about David Scrace as the print edition of the Albuquerque Journal recently called him the Fauci of New Mexico. Nothing new to report there except the Journal just had a bit of a puff piece about him, and his time as the czar, if you will, truly a czar, whatever his title was. He's one of the most powerful and impactful politicians in New Mexico history, unelected, of course, and somebody who, like Fauci, I think that's an apt description, wielded great power, but did not have a particularly good track record when things are all accounted for.
Yeah, and like Fauci, and the CDC and a lot of the other government agencies, he tended to go with the mainstream flow. He didn't ask a whole lot of questions. He would just take that, and in my view, he would take that and repackage it and put a New Mexico flavor on it. But he was doing what the strategic top-down approach was, and he really didn't ask many questions. And I'm not so sure, frankly, how much independent thought and analysis he really did, because say one policy where he really deviated from what the federal talking point was at any given time, and nothing comes to mind with me. I'm sure there's something out there, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. He did follow in lockstep with Fauci. So Scrace, while I'm sure that from his perspective, the last few years were a whirlwind and seemed like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, reality is that we could have used a chatbot equivalent of Fauci and just asked questions of a computerized Fauci and gotten much the same responses as we did with David Scrace. So, goodbye, Dr. Scrace. We won't miss you very much, I promise. Now, in terms of the legislature, I was back up there yesterday. A lot going on, and we're getting not quite crunch time. We're kind of in the, I guess you could say we're just before the 2-minute warning of the football game.
Or in basketball, the second TV timeout right before you go down the stretch.
Yeah, so we've still got a few weeks left, so there's plenty of time for the Democrats who control all the levers up there to shift things whatever direction they want to. We were talking about a tax increment development district, HB 353, that is being given, interestingly enough. So it's a form of a subsidy, a tax subsidy that the users or the owners, developers within a TID area, so an arbitrary line on a map, they essentially get to hold on to the tax revenue in that jurisdiction, and neighboring jurisdictions and the state will pay a lot of the taxes for all the new services that are required. So it's a weird subsidy, something that we've opposed, free market people have opposed. But the interesting kicker on this is that it's Lobo Development Corporation that is behind this particular development, South UNM campus.
Yeah.
And so it's ultimately a TID that's primarily benefiting the state's largest university's development arm, which is a quasi-private public. And these foundations, these offshoots of these public institutions are where a lot of, I think, questionable things happen. And our friend Daniel Libet, I know you remember him. He's the one who, for a year or two, really watchdogged UNM athletics. Then he still got a lawsuit out on the UNM Foundation, whether they have to disclose certain information. And I think that's pending at the state Supreme Court. But anyway, that's what took me up to Santa Fe yesterday. Actually, what physically took me up was yet another $2.25 round trip, 100-mile rail runner ticket. So $2.25. You can't get more subsidized than that.
No, you get I guess zero on the Albuquerque bus line, but yeah, that $2.25 probably keeps the worst characters off of the rail runner. So
yeah, plus the fact that you are ultimately going all the way up to Santa Fe. I'm not even sure if the homeless and their busy schedules would allow day trips up to Santa Fe, because ultimately you do get dumped off in Santa Fe and you can't just go back on the train southbound. You have to figure out something to do with yourself in Santa Fe. And in my case, it's legislative testimony. A bill that we have an interest in and had some conversations with folks, because it's a Republican sponsored bill. At least the lead sponsor, I would say, is Jason Harper, kind of the Republican side's guru on tax reform, doing some yeoman's work on the gross receipts tax. But HB 322 is something I wrote about at Heirs of Enchantment. You can, of course, go onto the legislature site and look up HB 322. It is a interesting bill. Now, as with all tax bills, it gets folded, it gets tabled in the committee, the House Tax Committee, and then potentially or not gets folded into a broader omnibus tax bill, which will be a big effort this year because of the big surplus.
Yeah, it's almost like line item veto in that committee. They put everything in there that they could, that would apply to that committee. And then does it make it to the final list or not? That's the big question. There's a lot of things in there that people are sweating on, both hoping it gets in there and a lot of things people are hoping doesn't get in there.
And we should be expecting that tax omnibus bill to be dropping here probably this week, because they need to have adequate debate. And time to move that through, and this could be a lot of good, a lot of bad. We're just going to have to find out. But this bill in particular takes the gross corporate income tax, which generates about $300 to $400 million a year. We should be just eliminating that thing right away with the money we have available. It's not a big revenue source.
And that's one of the things people looking to relocate to a state,
absolutely.
both corporations and individuals, look at that. Hey, no income tax. Let's go to New Mexico. It would.
Right. So right now we have two rates, which is it's a little bit odd. We have a 4.8% rate on $500,000 and below in profits. That rate jumps up to 5.9% for anything above $500,000. And this bill would take that lower rate and eliminate it, so we all have a straight across the board 5.9% corporate tax rate, which is higher than all of our neighboring states.
Who are going the other direction as well,
Exactly.
in general and in specific.
Yeah, and HB 322 also changes the factor of corporate taxation. Now, I'm pretty good at taxes, but change the corporate tax factorization model and what gets into those taxes and which is better and which is worse, single factor, multi-factor. It's not something that honestly I know a great deal about or care about, because New Mexico could easily eliminate the corporate income tax very, very quickly if we wanted to. Interestingly enough, though, if you go into the budget, the proposed budget on the governor's website, you go into the relevant charts, you will notice that there is a big negative number associated with the corporate income tax, about $150 or so million annually. This is where they account for the film subsidies. So the actual revenue of the corporate income tax is even below $300 to $400 million. It really winds up being closer to $150 to $200 million, because that's where you have to actually pay the bills, pay the piper for all those film subsidies that are being paid out. And, as much obfuscation and opacity dominates the film subsidy debate, you actually have to put it there in black and white.
I'm amazed they put it there. I would have thought they would have just done another place. You know what I mean? So that's a level of really conceptual honesty that we're not quite used to here in New Mexico on things like that.
Anyway, this post, Errors of Enchantment, why not reduce or eliminate corporate taxes? It has a nice map there from the Tax Foundation showing the neighboring states and their rates. Texas, of course, because they don't tax personal income, also don't tax corporate income, which is the way it should be. And it's one of the reasons that Texas is an economic dynamo. All of our neighboring states, Arizona 4.9, Utah 4.85, Colorado 4.55, and there we are at 5.9%. And considering to go up from there, at least in terms of cutting out a lower rate. Now, if instead of cutting out that bottom rate and going to 5.9, if we went to say 5.2 or something, that would for an overall tax rate, that would be fine. But that's not the plan for HB 322. And I think, especially when Republicans, Democrats, I hate to say it, but we kind of expect this kind of behavior from them. When you're monkeying around with the GRT, the corporate income tax, I always talk about the GRT, so it's always on my mind. The corporate income tax, we should be focusing on ways to just reduce or eliminate it. It is a tax that hinders the very kinds of diversification that we all say we want.
Yeah, and then the other thing about the income tax, Paul, back into the 2007-8, the financial crisis, the amount of income, because everyone was hurting, the amount of income tax that was paid during a crisis goes down even more.
Yeah, it's a volatile tax.
It's a very unreliable in a down economy. So, it is interesting. And, just a quick point on the 3-factor versus 1-factor. If you sit there and listen to the the pundits, they will argue all kinds of theory about which is best, but it all boils down to whichever way gets a particular company to pay less money, that's what its advocates argue for. And then all the three factor is that you use sales, payroll, and property in the state versus your total to allocate. And what that does is sometimes there's companies that have quite a bit of operations in New Mexico, but their sales are made elsewhere. So that kind of scoops them in. But there's no magic to that, and it's one of those. I don't know. I think the having the property thing here tends to scoop our friends in the oil and gas industry in a little more, probably.
You're talking about the factors.
The factors as opposed to just the sales, because most of the time you're not selling oil and gas that's produced in New Mexico. In New Mexico, it's sold elsewhere. But again, what if we didn't have an income tax? Yeah, we'd lose a few $100 million, and in terms of things that are likely to have a huge positive impact on our business climate and more companies wanting to come here, that's pretty low-hanging fruit. That's, but I don't think there's a chance in, there's not a chance in one in a million right now of that happening, maybe one of these years if we keep having big oil and gas revenue.
Yeah, just one of the political challenges you're always going to face, and this impacts Republicans and Democrats, is that if you have a individual income tax rate that is higher than the corporate income tax rate, that makes things difficult politically, because individual, average people who vote, unlike corporations, will say, well, why are you taxing me more than this big business? And that's a populist message that's hard to get around, and I get it. But the fact is that corporate income taxes, first and foremost, just the complexity, like you're talking about, it's just unnecessarily complicated, and it's also not a big source of money. But ultimately, there's no reason for the tax, because who pays it? Ultimately, it's individuals.
Individuals pay it. Corporations, notwithstanding the huge body of law about corporate persons and all of that. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. But at the end of the day, so who owns corporations? People own corporations, and so it impacts whether it's your retirement fund, if you're a state employee, whether you have a 401k, people own stock. So, it's one of those, it's a little bit like the reducing of the tax rate and allowing repatriation of funds that happened a few years back, how predictably successful that was. If you're to get rid of state income taxes across the board, that would be such a huge net positive for the economy of the entire United States. But, like you say, the populist message, these rich corporations don't pay anything, and my poor auntie is paying thousands of dollars of state income tax.
Yeah, and ultimately, government, especially politicians in states like New Mexico, tend to tax whatever they can get their hands on. So corporations are more mobile than individuals. That's why you tend to have some business tax exemptions and the ability for those businesses to avoid taxes, because they don't like what you're doing. They can easily move. It is harder for individuals to move, and that's just the way it works when it comes to a lot of these policies. Sadly, not fairly, but in reality. So moving on, we have paid leave, which is moving through the legislature.
Now, this is not the sick leave. That's already passed.
That's already passed. This is 12 weeks of paid leave. And just lest you think that this is all going to be, who pays? Well, half of a percentage point of your salary will be put into a fund to pay for this leave, not sick leave. And then 0.4% of your employers will be also put in. That ultimately is going to come out of something, and that's going to mean what they pay you. So you're really going to be putting in a percentage point of your overall pay, more or less. And that's assuming that the fund is solvent, which is one of the problems that people are talking about, is that there could easily be, once you put the dish of milk out, the cats will tend to come, and the people who take advantage of it are going to be a relatively small, very frequent flyer kind of group, as opposed to the rest of folks who don't use the paid leave nearly as often. But this is SB 11, one of the most controversial, one of the most potentially economically damaging pieces of legislation in the entire session, soon to be voted on the Senate floor. It made its way out of the Senate Finance Committee with one Democrat, George Munoz, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, opposing it, but given the numbers in the legislature, it still managed to slide through that committee. We'll see where it goes on the Senate floor, and then over to the House. And the governor so far has not taken a position on this, which I find not interesting, not surprising, because while I think the governor tended to tack towards the progressives in the first 4 years of her administration, I'm not saying I'm like hopeful that she's some kind of newfound
born
moderate.
again Ron DeSantis. Is that what we're hoping for?
Yeah, no, that would be a wrong hope. But I do think that this is sufficiently problematic, both the policy plus the administrative side of things, and just the very serious concerns that we could get either some alterations in terms of a line item veto or an outright veto, and say, look, you got to come up with a better approach here. I'm not saying that I'm confident of that, but we shall see where this whole paid leave thing goes. SB 11 is the bill, again, on the Senate floor in the next few days.
Yeah, and Paul, I looked at it very early in the session, and maybe some of these problems have been worked out, but it's so complicated and so volatile. You have to pay in for a period of time with no benefit at all to build up a fund, because otherwise, it would probably be bankrupt from day one, which just shows some of the issues about that. Because believe me, taxes were like, oh, here's the initial rate, 0.5% on employees. What will it be in the future? Will it be 0.75%? Will it be 1%? We don't know, and they don't know. And again, this is on top of an already very liberal, very easy to qualify sick leave bill that's been put out there. So, and again, but what about the children? Nobody has more sympathy for people with long-term illnesses, but to put a program like this in that applies to very small businesses where, you don't know who's going to be there on, if you have a small staff of 6 people, who's going to be there on a day-by-day, month-by-month basis, this could create some problems. It'd drive people to Texas more than a lot of the policies we've done in the past several years that, guess what, have driven people to Texas.
Yeah, we have paid sick leave on the books in New Mexico. Definitely some, I think, potential conflicts inherent with 2 different kinds of leave. Just really the administrative burden on smaller businesses that are beholden to this will be a big part of the problem. They'll just say, look, I can do business in other states, including Texas. I don't have to deal with these policies and all the confusion and hyper-regulation. So I'm going to go elsewhere and be happier doing it. So SB 11 is just to kind of give folks a overall impression of where I see things going. With the surplus available, we have a lot of opportunities as in the legislature has a lot of opportunities to do some pretty positive things for New Mexico. Sure, there's going to be some policies we don't necessarily love that are enacted this session, but there are really 2 things that could completely overwhelm any positives on the tax reform. And, by positives, I mean, I hope and expect that the GRT, gross receipts tax, pyramiding of services will be addressed this session. And that, as you know, Wally, the tipping point New Mexico drinking game 480 episodes in, that is something that we talk about. I refer to it as the original sin of New Mexico tax policy. It's something that absolutely needs to be considered and done away with ASAP. Should have been done a decade ago, 2 decades ago. But paid leave and added progressivity to New Mexico's tax code in the order of HB 119, which we've talked about, where you add a 6.5 and a 6.9% rate on top of the 5.9% rate, which in and of itself is higher than the one under Bill Richardson. Those are the two things that could really undermine a lot of the progress if gross receipts tax reform were to be done successfully this session.
Yes, and as we've alluded to a lot, and in this, I think the bigger bang for the buck from a PR point of view would be eliminating the income tax. But in terms of impact, reforming the gross receipts tax is far bigger. But a lot of people don't ever get to that point when they look at New Mexico as a place to retire or move their business, because we do have an income tax, and they go to places that don't. But those who come here are often, once they get here, are often a bit surprised at the reach of the gross receipts tax and how bad it is for businesses, particularly small and startup businesses.
Yeah. So moving on, better late than never here for our friends at the Albuquerque Journal. But we've been talking about Mississippi as a educational success story and how they have turned things around there in that state when it comes to especially reading since I think May of 2021.
July 1, 2021 is the post date of Jameson Taylor discusses the Mississippi model for education.
And of course, I ran across that story before, and I think I posted something else.
I'm sure you did. But the point is, even on this podcast, you talked about that.
So front page of the Journal this week, Albuquerque Journal had I think a fair write-up of Mississippi. Didn't quite focus enough on how closely a lot of what Mississippi has done resembled what Susana Martinez did or tried to do. And I think that is a function of short-term reporters not really having a great deal of historical knowledge. There's been some turnover in the Albuquerque Journal's reporting staff in the education area particularly. But also not wanting to credit a Republican and blame the Democrat legislature for their opposition. Also, quoting union folks in education articles is like they have.
Mr. Fox, would you like to be left alone in the hen house for a while longer?
Yeah,
yes, I would.
They have no inherent knowledge of the education system that transcends anything else that anybody on the street has. They simply are one of the most powerful interest groups involved in education, keeping the system as it stands. So, they especially oppose the third grade social promotion ban that the state of Mississippi has imposed, that the reformers there interviewed in the Journal story cite as one of the key components of their reform. But in addition to kind of while New Mexico has put some money and put some emphasis into early childhood, you don't hear the governor talking about not early childhood reading. You don't hear the governor talk much about it. You don't hear the bully pulpit saying we need to turn around reading scores and reading performance in New Mexico. You don't hear the education secretary, whoever they may be, in that revolving door.
You can't tell the players without a program at the education department.
Right. So you just don't have that kind of philosophical buy-in, I think, that Mississippi seems to have engaged with. And those are just some of the reasons why I think Mississippi has left us in the dust. And it would surprise me if New Mexico moves the needle here. Quite frankly, for the rest of the Lujan Grisham administration, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, and I was reading in the Journal, they gave the gratuitous comment, well, no, and I don't know how you get to be 52nd. I guess District of Columbia, maybe Puerto Rico. But anyway, if there were states, we would be 50th. Nobody in New Mexico wants to be 52nd. I would argue that that's just not true. I mean, that sounds like it should be true, but based on the policies we have, when you won't do anything about it, if you keep doing what got us to last place and don't make any reforms or any changes of any kind, maybe you really don't care if we're last. So,
yeah, I think that it's it's so true in all areas of human behavior that, yeah, you may want to improve your life and get a job or lose weight or stop doing drugs. But if you don't actually take any steps in that direction, it is a kind of tacit admission that you're okay with where things stand. And yeah, that's a real point of view and real factor here. So we'll see. We're going to have presumably a new education secretary yet again in the state of New Mexico, and maybe through some alchemy, you will have that individual really pushing and dedicating themselves to early childhood reading. I remain unconvinced that anything that this governor does, because it reflects the interests of the unions so closely, that it'll ever move the needle. So.
Yeah, and then Paul, the interest of the union, it's not necessarily the interest of the union membership. It's the interest of the union leaders, because again, this will be, I just dissed the Journal's gratuitous comment. Let me give my own. No teacher wants to do a bad job.
Sure.
So let's say I will actually give them that one, and you can make arguments against that. But if the system that you're working in and how you do things and the approach continues to be a way that fails, it doesn't matter what you want. So, this is a big challenge for New Mexico, and man, I certainly hope we do something. I mean, just one final point, Paul, is I remember when I listened to Jameson Taylor talk about the Mississippi model, he frankly didn't realize that almost everything they did in Mississippi had been tried to be implemented in New Mexico and never was implemented. Right. It was, if you want to be depressed, just listen to that. It's pretty much what Susana Martinez and then her never confirmed Secretary of Education, Hannah Scandera, tried to do, but it's moved the needle in great amounts in Mississippi. And, that's probably, oh man, it's like, it would be tough if you held a gun to my head, which is the worst policy failure between our gross receipts tax and our education policy. I think I would have to say our education policy is even worse than our gross receipts tax policy. Ooh. As a thing. I mean, it's that bad. We are dead last, and with no indication that will move under our current programs.
And we don't say if you want to be depressed. We say if you want to be informed.
Okay, if you want to be informed and depressed, because, Paul, I'm usually not too depressed on public policy, even that I find, shocking, for lack of a better word. But that one, I was just shaking my head. It was like, oh, my goodness. So.
Even though you live in the cesspool of foreign policy or of policy,
yeah,
it is what it is. Well, speaking of cesspools and policy, again, education. Now we're drilling down to Albuquerque Public Schools, and it's kind of cool, even though it's horrible, because Project Veritas exposed Albuquerque Public Schools and its treatment of transgender students, specifically the way they hide. Not just, but one of the things they do is at Albuquerque Public Schools, as this hidden video from Project Veritas points out, APS really enables and hides transgenderism from the parents, and even imposes a lot of costs, I think, on fellow students. For example, according to this hidden video, and this is a official from APS, funded, interestingly enough, at least in part by the CDC. So the Biden administration's hands are in this as well. If one day Johnny goes to school and declares themselves to be a female, or perhaps some of the other 200 or so genders that are out there, they can use the bathroom of their preference. They don't need any documentation, any gender support plans, as they call it. They just waltz on into the girls' room, or I suppose vice versa, if there's any young ladies out there who want to see what's going on in the boys' bathroom. Then all APS staff must use the student's preferred pronoun. And again, it's one thing to call Johnny Jane and reflect that in their pronouns. It's another thing to, you can go on to various social media forums and see just how wild some of these pronouns can be, horse self and mare self, just all kinds of goofy stuff that has to do with animals and bunnies and witches and you name it. And then finally, as noted, that if a child decides to go by a different gender, they can be transitioned at school without informing the parents. So this video is posted at airsofenchantment.com. It's less than 7 minutes in length. This individual from APS is very candid in what she says about this issue. And sadly, I haven't seen any bombshell reports from the local media outlets or anything that they've been talking about. I can tell you that I did send this to some APS board members, the school board, and they just passed a parental rights policy a few months ago. So I am going to be very interested to see what this APS school board has to say about this video and the way things are handled at APS on gender issues.
Yeah, and notwithstanding the parental rights, it is amazing when it comes to dealing with children, how parental rights have just been, obliterated in all aspects of our society. It's very interesting that, try to, for your son or daughter to get an ear piercing, it would require parental permission under 18. But, the sort of things that they're talking about here can be done without the parents' knowledge. Does not seem like that is a good track to go. But yeah, here we have it. It's come to Albuquerque, it's come to New Mexico, and it's come to APS.
Yeah, and if you want to know why my daughters, who once upon a time pre-COVID did attend an Albuquerque public school, and we were reasonably satisfied with that. But if you want to know why they will not be returning to an APS school, academic performance is part of the equation. But quite frankly, I think my kids could do okay regardless of where they are attending school. This is the kind of thing that with 3 daughters, I am not interested in sending them back into an Albuquerque Public Schools building. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm still paying for that, and that's the way this monopolistic government-run system works. We're going to go to a new proposal, newish. It's HB 400, another possible bad law coming out of Santa Fe. We shall see what happens in this issue. But HB 400 would take our Medicaid program, already 47% of New Mexicans on the program, and expand it. Currently, it would allow, this law would allow those with incomes greater than 133% of the federal poverty level, all the way up to 400% of the federal poverty level, to gain Medicaid benefits. Interestingly enough, it's about 120,000, 100,000 New Mexicans, 5.7% of the population. So you would have officially over 50% of New Mexicans, if this were to be enacted, placed on the Medicaid system, 47% according to the LFC report. So HB 400 just got its first hearing in a committee yesterday. It did move its way out. Obviously, we need to be focusing on getting more people off of welfare in the state of New Mexico, more people into the job market, which affects workforce participation. And if you keep expanding Medicaid in particular, you're going to wind up with fewer and fewer medical professionals. So this kind of policy impacts a lot of different things in our state, not generally in a good way.
Yes, and then, and I've said, pardon the pun of the name of this podcast, but healthcare in New Mexico and medical doctors and the like is already at a tipping point. And to add more Medicaid to a system that is basically starting to fail all around us, with Medicaid being one of the major points, it doesn't matter what system you're on if you don't have doctors in your state. What good is it? What is the point after all? And to move in the other direction when we've already said that Medicaid is part of the problem, and the legislature is even considering some things to reduce the negative impacts that Medicaid's having on healthcare in New Mexico, to then say, hey, let's just add a lot more people in there. That's the solution. Wow, this is not good. And then, Paul, you heard it from me. I call for a special session because I know they're not going to deal with all of the doctor and healthcare issues this session. But man, that is becoming the emergency. The quiet killer in New Mexico is what a sad state our doctor situation here is. And there's yet something else that would make it structurally worse, probably forever.
Yeah, so need to get away from government dependency. I know that is what consists of tough love, tough medicine for New Mexico. It's never a good thing. It's certainly one of the worst aspects of New Mexico that we have so much dependency unnecessarily due to policy decisions that have been made over the years. The challenge for any New Mexico politician should be to work on ways to slowly wean New Mexicans off of New Mexico's economy as well, off of the tremendous dependency we have on the federal government. But certainly Medicaid is kind of the open sore, the open wound of that government dependency. It's one of the worst possible aspects for the way it does hinder so many other things that we want to see happen in New Mexico. Finally, the Biden administration has quietly admitted that the line Biden was using, about 9,000 unused oil permits, is wrong. The number's about 6,700, but the fact is that the Biden administration just can't get its facts straight, and whatever the number of permits is that's out there, the Biden administration has been anti-oil and gas, which so far it hasn't impacted New Mexico because there are both enough permits and enough wells and other opportunities for oil and gas to thrive in New Mexico. But it's worth noting that 9,000 number was yet another falsehood coming from this administration. And that kind of thing impacts New Mexico and its economy more than anywhere else. And if you want to see that surplus and that boom dry up, which will impact not just New Mexico, but folks around the entire country and around the globe, it certainly is good. They're doing a good job of trying to limit oil and gas exploitation here in New Mexico through the Biden administration.
Yeah, and they're doing a good job. As we've said, the permits and all of that was probably overblown in the short term, but Believe me, they keep incrementally moving towards it, and so it's going to be one of three things: total reliance on renewables, or maybe a lot more nuclear in our future, or the lights will be out most of the time. So we'll have to see where this goes. But the policies are erratic and haphazard, to put it mildly.
Yep. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there this week. More to talk about in the next few weeks on the legislature, and hopefully we can minimize the damage and maximize the successes. And we'll just talk to you again next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.